The catapult fires. Steam erupts across the bow. An F/A-18 Super Hornet accelerates from 0 to flight speed in under 3 seconds, flung off the deck of a Nimitz-class carrier into the gray Pacific haze. $13 billion of warship. One of the most powerful concentrations of conventional military force the world has ever put to sea. And at the moment that jet clears the bow, it carries enough internal fuel to strike a target roughly 450 nautical miles away and come back. 450 miles. The DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missile, fielded by the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, is credited with a range exceeding 2,000 nautical miles. So here is the question that sits at the center of every Pacific Fleet planning meeting, every war game, every budget argument in the Pentagon. Why does the United States Navy keep betting $13 billion on a ship whose main striking arm, on internal fuel, on a clean day, can't reach the system designed to destroy it? That's not a rhetorical question. It has an answer. But the answer isn't where most people look for it. It's not in the price tag. It's not in the range chart. It's in a problem that neither side has fully solved, and the solution, if there is one, is still being built. Stay with us, because by the time we're done, the paradox will look different than it does right now. To understand what a carrier actually is, you have to start with what it replaced. Before the Second World War, naval power was measured in battleship guns, 16-inch rifles that could hurl a 2,000-pound shell 20 miles. The aircraft carrier made that whole calculus obsolete in about 18 months of combat. Suddenly, the weapons didn't need to be attached to the ship. The ship just needed to get close enough to launch them. An aircraft, in 1942, could reach a few hundred miles, which was more than enough to destroy a fleet that had no idea you were there. That logic has governed American naval strategy ever since. The carrier is not a weapons platform in the conventional sense. It is a mobile airfield, a floating base that moves 700 miles a day across open ocean, that positions itself where no land base exists, that projects air power into regions where the United States has no permanent foothold. The Nimitz-class carriers, 11 of which remain in service or commission, and the newer USS Gerald R. Ford, which represents the next generation of that same idea, are the physical embodiment of American forward presence. The air wing carried aboard a Nimitz-class typically numbers around 70 to 80 aircraft. The backbone of that wing today is the F/A-18 Super Hornet, the Block 3 variant, upgraded with an advanced cockpit, conformal fuel tanks, and enhanced networking, alongside the EA-18G Growler for electronic warfare, E-2D Advanced Hawkeye for airborne early warning, and a growing number of unmanned systems. An air wing of this composition can conduct strike missions, fleet air defense, anti-submarine warfare, and surveillance simultaneously. No other nation currently deploys anything close to this combination at sea, but the range problem has been real since the Cold War. The original F-14 Tomcat, with its long-range AIM-54 Phoenix missiles, gave the carrier a reach that extended well beyond the aircraft's own flight radius. The Phoenix could engage targets at over 100 miles, meaning the Tomcat didn't have to fly to the threat. When the Super Hornet replaced it, the Navy traded raw range for affordability and versatility. The Super Hornet is a remarkable airplane. It is not a long-range strike aircraft. On internal fuel, its combat radius sits around 450 nautical miles, depending on the mission, the loadout, the profile. With external tanks and a permissive environment, that number grows. But external tanks create drag, reduce weapon stations, and require permissive conditions to jettison safely. In a contested environment, those conditions may not exist. Here's what most people assume, that range on a spec sheet translates directly to operational reach. It doesn't. Not for aircraft, not for missiles, not for either side. The DF-26 entered PLA service around 2016, designated as a conventional and nuclear-capable intermediate-range ballistic missile. Western intelligence assessments credit it with a range between 3,000 and 4,000 kilometers. Call it 1,600 to 2,100 nautical miles. It is road mobile, which makes it hard to target and easy to disperse. It carries a maneuvering re-entry vehicle designed to defeat ballistic missile defenses. It is, on paper, a carrier hunting weapon, hence its informal designation in Western analysis as the carrier killer. The price asymmetry is stark. A Nimitz-class hull costs roughly $13 billion. A single DF-26 is estimated in the low tens of millions. The arithmetic of attrition runs hard against the carrier if you accept those numbers at face value, which is exactly the frame Beijing's planners want you to use. But here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface, and it's the part that changes everything. A missile with 2,000 plus miles of range still has to know where to point. Finding a carrier is not like finding a city. A carrier strike group moves. It moves fast, consistently above 20 knots, sometimes significantly faster. At 20 knots sustained, a carrier covers nearly 500 nautical miles in a single day. The Western Pacific covers more than 60 million square miles. If you want to hit a carrier with a ballistic missile, you don't just need range. You need a targeting solution. Precise, current, and reliable. Good enough to put a maneuvering warhead within lethal distance of a ship that has been moving for the entire duration of the missile's flight. That targeting chain is the real contest. And it is genuinely hard. The components required are substantial. You need persistent over-the-horizon surveillance, satellites, long-range maritime patrol aircraft, submarine contacts, over-the-horizon radar. You need real-time or near-real-time data fusion, because a targeting solution that is 12 minutes old for a fast-moving ship may be useless. You need a communications architecture that can pass that solution to a launch battery without it being jammed, spoofed, or intercepted. And you need to do all of that in a degraded electronic environment, because the moment a carrier strike group knows it is being targeted, it begins doing everything in its power to break that targeting chain. The EA-18G Growler exists precisely for that purpose. Its job is electronic warfare, jamming radar, suppressing communications, degrading the sensor picture that any adversary needs to prosecute a targeting solution. A carrier strike group with active Growler support is a fundamentally different target than one sitting inert in harbor. The Growler doesn't make the carrier invisible, but it makes the targeting chain unreliable. And an unreliable targeting chain means a missile that may be aimed at where the carrier was, not where it is. Put yourself in the position of PLA rocket force planners for a moment. You have a 2,000-mile missile. You have satellites in orbit. You have Type 055 destroyers at sea, each carrying long-range sensors, feeding your picture. You have maritime patrol aircraft operating over the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea. The problem is that the carrier knows you have all of those things, and it has been designed, the entire strike group has been designed, to degrade every link in that chain simultaneously. This is the first layer of the answer to our opening question. The range gap on the chart is real. The operational gap is considerably smaller, but it doesn't close the problem entirely, and the Navy knows it. We spent some time looking at the actual program records on the MQ-25 Stingray, and one detail kept pulling our attention. Not the airplane itself, but the timeline. The MQ-25 has been in development since the early 2010s in various forms, under various program names. It didn't reach initial operational capability until 2025. That's a decade-plus program to solve a problem the Navy identified clearly in the early 2000s, when the Super Hornet was still new, and the DF-21D was entering PLA service. That timeline tells you something about the institutional difficulty of the problem, not the technical difficulty, the institutional one. The MQ-25 Stingray is the Navy's answer to the range gap. It is an unmanned aerial refueling aircraft, a tanker drone, designed to operate off carrier decks, extend the range of the F/A-18 Super Hornet and F-35C by offloading fuel at distance, and push the effective strike radius of the air wing outward. The current program of record calls for approximately 72 MQ-25S across the fleet. Each one, used optimally, can push a Super Hornet's effective combat radius out by several hundred miles, potentially past 700 nautical miles under the right conditions. That still doesn't reach 2,000, but it changes the geometry. It means the carrier doesn't have to be as close. It means the launch basket for a strike moves outward. It means the ship has more ocean to hide in before it has to commit. The MQ-25 also creates a new problem, which is characteristic of every genuine capability advance. It introduces new dependencies. The MQ-25 has to survive long enough to transfer fuel. It has to operate in a contested airspace environment against an adversary that fields long-range surface-to-air missiles and fighter aircraft, J-20 Chengdu stealth fighters, with sensors capable of detecting non-stealthy tanker drones at considerable range. If the tanker is shot down before the transfer, the strike mission either aborts or the strike aircraft proceed on internal fuel and compress right back into the original range problem. One tanker drone, roughly $65 to $90 million per airframe, solves the range problem only in conditions where it can survive, which is a condition that requires the carrier strike group to first suppress the threat environment, which requires aircraft to fly into the threat environment, which requires range. The problem folds back on itself. This is the second obstacle the Navy is working through. The tanker solution requires permissive conditions that the tanker itself cannot guarantee. The response has been to pair MQ-25 operations with F-35C coverage, using the stealth and sensor fusion of the Joint Strike Fighter to suppress threats, clear corridors, allow the MQ-25 to complete its mission. But this adds complexity, adds coordination burden, and adds more aircraft to a mission that began with one airplane trying to hit a target at range. The F-35C, the carrier variant of the Joint Strike Fighter, has a combat radius roughly comparable to the Super Hornet on internal fuel, around 600 nautical miles. Its stealth makes it survivable in ways the Super Hornet is not. Its sensor suite makes it a far more capable sensor node than any previous carrier aircraft. But it is not a long-range strike platform in the way a B-21 Raider or a land-based bomber is. It is a fifth-generation multi-role aircraft that happens to operate off carrier decks, which means the carrier's core range problem hasn't been solved by the F-35C. It's been managed somewhat. What strikes us about this whole set of trade-offs is that they reveal something the range chart conceals. The carrier isn't designed to fight alone, and it never was. The question was always whether the systems designed to support it can keep pace with the threat designed to destroy it. The economic arithmetic of carrier aviation is genuinely uncomfortable, and the Navy has never fully resolved the tension at its center. A single Nimitz-class carrier hull, approximately $13 billion at current prices. A Gerald R. Ford-class hull, the most recent completion. Closer to $13.3 billion for the lead ship, with follow-on hulls projected somewhat lower as construction learning improves. The air wing aboard, another $15 billion to $20 billion in aircraft, depending on the mix of Super Hornets, F-35Cs, Growlers, and Hawkeyes. The 4 Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers and the Ticonderoga-class cruiser, or in newer groupings, additional Burkes. That form the carrier strike group's screen, $2 to $3 billion each. The attack submarines that travel with the group, providing undersea defense and long-range strike, $3 to $4 billion per Virginia-class hull. Added up, and a fully equipped carrier strike group represents somewhere between $40 and $50 billion in capital assets, not counting the cost of training the roughly 7,500 people who crew it. Against that, a DF-26 missile estimated at $20 million, a salvo of 10, $200 million, a salvo of 50, $1 billion. The math is not subtle. If an adversary can achieve a high probability of striking a carrier with a salvo of missiles, and the strike group's Aegis combat system, SM-6 interceptors, and standard missile batteries cannot intercept the entire salvo, then the exchange ratio runs catastrophically against the carrier. This is not a secret. Pentagon war games have examined this scenario extensively. The results, where they've been disclosed or reported, suggest that in high-end conflict scenarios, carrier survivability in the Western Pacific is a genuine concern. Not a certainty of loss, but a concern. Here's the take that will probably generate some pushback. The Navy's continued investment in nuclear-powered carriers, at the pace and cost that investment requires, reflects institutional inertia as much as strategic calculation. The case for the carrier is real and well documented. But the case for 13-plus carriers, for the current force structure, the current basing posture, the current air wing composition, rests significantly on industrial relationships, congressional support, and service identity, not just on cold operational analysis. That doesn't make the carrier wrong. It makes the debate around it more complicated than the Navy's public posture suggests. The counter-argument, which is also real, there is no substitute, at any price point, for what a carrier provides in peacetime. The carrier is diplomacy with a flight deck. It is the credible signal of commitment that keeps alliances coherent. It is the platform that can respond to a humanitarian crisis, a no-fly zone, a non-state actor, a piracy problem, a North Korean provocation. All of the scenarios below the threshold of great power conflict, where the United States still has persistent interests. No missile battery does that. No submarine does that. The carrier's value is not purely in its ability to survive a peer conflict. It's in its ability to shape the environment that precedes one. That argument is strategically sound. It does not fully answer the range question. And it is not the same argument as saying the carrier is invulnerable. Here's where the architecture of the problem actually lives, and it's not where the debate usually focuses. The carrier's survivability in a high-end conflict depends less on the range of its aircraft than on the functioning of three interlocking systems: the ability to break the adversary's targeting chain, the ability to absorb and intercept an incoming salvo, and the ability to reposition before a second salvo can be prepared and launched. If all three functions work simultaneously, the carrier is a genuinely difficult target. If any one of them fails, the calculus shifts dramatically. The first function, breaking the targeting chain, is the Growler's job, augmented by cyber and space capabilities that don't appear in any unclassified order of battle. The EA-18G Growler, operating in a network with the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye and the ship's own Aegis sensors, provides the carrier group with what planners call electromagnetic maneuver warfare. The ability to shape the adversary's sensor picture to appear where you aren't, to disappear where you are. The raid was over as far as the adversary's sensors could tell. The carrier had dropped off the synthetic aperture radar returns that fed the targeting solution. And that, not the missile's range, not the aircraft's range, was the operational center of gravity. But what no one in open source analysis fully resolves is the convergence problem. What happens when an adversary's targeting chain includes not just radar and aircraft, but commercial satellite constellations, fishing vessels acting as reporting nets, underwater sensor arrays, and passive acoustic monitoring of the carrier's propulsion signature? The electromagnetic spectrum is only one domain. The carrier generates signatures across several. The Growler suppresses some of them. It cannot suppress all of them simultaneously. This is where the midpoint of our story opens a new layer. We've established that the range gap is real, but narrower in practice than on paper, that the MQ-25 partially addresses it at cost and complexity, and that the targeting chain is the genuine friction point. What we haven't addressed is the shipyard arithmetic, because that's the third dimension of this contest, and it may be the most consequential. The United States currently operates two facilities capable of building nuclear-powered aircraft carriers: Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, the sole source for Ford-class construction. 1 yard. 1 carrier production line. The current program funds roughly 1 new carrier every 5 to 7 years. Against that, the People's Liberation Army Navy has commissioned more surface combatant tonnage in the past decade than any navy in history. Not nuclear-powered carriers, but destroyers, cruisers, amphibious vessels, and Coast Guard-adjacent ships at a production tempo that consistently surprises outside analysts. The Type 055 large destroyer, roughly comparable in displacement to an American cruiser, is being built at a pace that suggests Beijing's shipyards are operating at near wartime production tempo during peacetime. That contrast matters for a reason that goes beyond counting hulls. Industrial capacity is latent military power. A nation that can build ships quickly can recover from losses quickly. A nation with 1 nuclear carrier yard cannot. The United States lost no capital ships to enemy action after 1945. Its industrial base reflected that. What the Navy is now confronting is the realization that the adversary's industrial base has been modernized and scaled in ways that American capacity cannot currently match, and that this asymmetry compounds every other vulnerability. What would you do if you were the CNO facing that chart? That's not a rhetorical question. Drop your answer in the comments, because the trade-offs here are genuinely not obvious, and the disagreements inside the building are real. One detail from the program records on the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers stuck with me. The SM-6 Interceptor, the primary weapon for engaging ballistic missile threats to the carrier strike group, costs approximately $4 million per round. An Arleigh Burke carries a limited number of them in its vertical launch cells, competing with Tomahawk land attack missiles, anti-submarine rockets, and standard missile variants for cell space. The total inventory of SM-6 missiles in the U.S. Navy is not publicly disclosed in precise terms, but available budget documents suggest it is in the low thousands across the entire fleet. A DF-26 salvo capable of threatening a carrier strike group might involve dozens of missiles, not because that's the minimum needed, but because the targeting geometry requires saturation to overcome a layered defense. The adversary fires enough to exhaust the interceptor inventory, overwhelm the phalanx CIWS last-ditch defense at closer ranges, and accept that some portion of the salvo will be intercepted while banking on enough leakers to achieve effect. The Phalanx close-in weapon system, the last layer of point defense, fires depleted uranium rounds at 3,000 rounds per minute. Against a ballistic reentry vehicle traveling at Mach 10 or faster, physics is unforgiving. Phalanx was designed for subsonic and low supersonic sea-skimming missiles. Its effectiveness against a hypersonic maneuvering reentry vehicle is, in open-source analysis, considered limited. The Navy is developing and fielding directed energy weapons, laser systems on future Arleigh-Burke variants, that could eventually provide near-unlimited magazine depth for point defense, but eventually is not the same as now. And the adversary's production tempo is not waiting for eventually. The exchange ratio problem. Interceptors at 4 million each versus missiles at tens of millions apiece is less severe than the drone versus interceptor exchange ratio the Navy faces in other theaters. But it is real, and it compounds with every ship deployed because each ship has finite cells, finite reload capacity, and no way to resupply at sea without returning to a logistics hub that is itself a target. Here's where the strategic cost lands, stripped of the rhetoric on both sides. The carrier is not obsolete, but it is operating in an environment where the cost of the threat has dropped relative to the cost of the asset being threatened, where the targeting problem that once protected the carrier is becoming, slowly, unevenly, more tractable for the adversary, and where the industrial capacity to replace losses no longer clearly favors the United States. None of those trends is individually decisive. Together, they constitute a genuine strategic problem that the Navy cannot spend or build its way out of within the current planning horizon. The response: longer range through MQ-25 tanking, better survivability through F-35C integration, deeper magazines through directed energy, distributed lethality through smaller surface combatants. Is real. It is funded to varying degrees, and it moves in the right direction. Whether it moves fast enough is a different question. The F/A-18 Super Hornet production line closed in 2024. The Block 3 variants already in inventory will serve for decades. The MQ-25 will gradually extend the air wing's reach. The F-35C will provide the carrier with a survivable, networked strike capability that the Super Hornet cannot match in a contested environment. The USS Gerald R. Ford, commissioned in 2017 and still working through operational milestones, represents the next generation of carrier design. Electromagnetic catapults, advanced arresting gear, dual-band radar, higher sortie rates. But the most counterintuitive element of the whole contest is this: the adversary's targeting problem doesn't get easier just because the missile gets better. The ocean is still 60 million square miles. A carrier moving at 20+ knots, with active electronic warfare, acoustic signature management, and distributed strike group positioning, is a harder target in 2026 than it was in 2006, even though the missile that hunts it has improved faster than the carrier has. The real question isn't whether the carrier can outrange the DF-26. It was never going to outrange it. The real question is whether the carrier can make itself unfindable long enough for its air wing to matter. And that question doesn't have a simple answer because both sides are running the same race. Sensors versus stealth, targeting chains versus electronic warfare, salvo size versus interceptor inventory, and neither side has broken decisively ahead. So here is the answer to the question we opened with, such as it is. The Navy sails a $13 billion carrier with an air wing that can't outrange a $20 million missile because the carrier was never designed to win on range. It was designed to win on presence, on versatility, on the ability to put 500 miles of striking power anywhere on the globe without permission from a host nation, and to do that continuously for 30+ years of operational service. The DF-26's range is an operational constraint on where the carrier can safely operate. It is not a mission kill. Because the carrier's mission is not to duel the DF-26 at 2,000 miles, it's to be where it needs to be when it needs to be there, and to make the cost of finding it and hitting it high enough that the adversary hesitates before trying. The answer to the range gap is not a single solution. It's 3 parallel bets. The first bet: close the range gap with tanker drones. More MQ-25 Stingrays per air wing, longer-range weapons launched from further out. LRASM anti-ship missiles with ranges exceeding 500 miles, giving the Super Hornet a standoff punch that extends well beyond the aircraft's own flight radius. The second bet: make the targeting chain harder to close. More Growlers, better electronic warfare, distributed strike group positioning, space-based and cyber capabilities that deny the adversary the real-time sensor picture needed to prosecute a DF-26 launch. The third bet, distribute the risk. Fewer eggs in $13 billion baskets. More Virginia-class submarines with Tomahawk capacity. More Arleigh Burke-class destroyers with SM-6 and long-range anti-ship missiles. The Constellation-class frigates coming online to add hulls at lower cost. The carrier remains the centerpiece, but the strike group increasingly operates as a distributed network rather than a carrier-centric formation. Each bet carries its own bill. The MQ-25 program costs, the Growler upgrades cost, the Virginia-class submarine program costs, and all of them compete with the carrier hull program for the same defense budget that has been, in real terms, under pressure since 2010. Whether you lean toward closing the range gap with more tankers and longer-ranged weapons, or toward making the ocean harder to search through better electronic warfare and distributed operations, or toward some combination, the Navy has placed all three bets simultaneously, because it can't afford to be wrong about which one works. The strategic cost of the range gap isn't measured in aircraft specifications. It's measured in what the Navy has to spend and what it has to accept to keep the carrier relevant in an environment that has moved against it. The crews of Nimitz-class and Gerald R. Ford-class carriers are deployed roughly 7 months out of every 24 in peacetime, a tempo that has remained high for 2 decades of continuous forward presence requirements. The maintenance cycle on a nuclear carrier runs roughly 2 to 3 years for a midlife refueling and complex overhaul, RCOH, during which the ship is unavailable for deployment. At any given moment, the 11 operational carriers provide about 3 to 4 simultaneously deployable hulls. That is the actual number the Navy has available for a Pacific contingency that requires sustained presence. 3 to 4. Against an adversary that has been commissioning new surface combatants at a rate that has doubled the size of its blue water Navy in roughly 15 years, including the Fujian, its third aircraft carrier and first to feature electromagnetic catapults comparable to the Ford class. The force size question is not academic. It is the arithmetic that underlies every basing decision, every deployment schedule, every alliance conversation in Tokyo and Canberra and Manila. The Fujian, Type 003, represents a genuine capability step for the plan. It can operate fixed-wing aircraft at heavier loads than its predecessors. It signals that Beijing is committed to carrier aviation as a long-term capability, not just a prestige project. It is not yet an operational threat comparable to a Nimitz-class in terms of air-wing capability, pilot experience, or system integration. But the trajectory is what matters, and the trajectory has been consistently ahead of most Western estimates. Here's what this tells us about where the contest actually is. It isn't about any single weapons system. The DF-26 is a real constraint. The range gap is a real problem. But the deeper competition is between an American naval establishment that has had carrier aviation at the center of its identity and doctrine for 80 years, and that is now asked to restructure that doctrine against a threat environment it didn't face during those 80 years, and an adversary that designed its Navy from the beginning to contest American carrier operations in a specific geographic theater. That structural asymmetry doesn't resolve in a budget cycle. It doesn't resolve with a better tanker drone. It resolves, or doesn't, over decades, through industrial investment, through alliance architecture, through the slow accumulation of operational learning that only comes from actually operating advanced systems at sea. The catapult fires again. Another Super Hornet clears the bow, climbs into the Pacific sky, turns south toward the contested waters of the South China Sea. Behind it, the carrier turns into the wind and prepares to launch the next aircraft. The ship moves. The ocean is enormous. The DF-26 battery, somewhere on a Chinese coast road, is mobile too. So here is the open question. The Navy can close the range gap with more MQ-25 Stingrays, longer-range weapons, better tanking cycles. Or it can bet that the ocean stays too large and too complex to search reliably. That the targeting chain will always have friction. That electronic warfare and speed and ocean geometry are sufficient protection. Or it rebuilds the force around distributed lethality. Fewer eggs in expensive baskets, more submarines and more frigates, and less dependence on the carrier as the singular asset. Each path costs differently. Each carries different risks. The Navy has chosen elements of all three, and the budget to fully execute all three simultaneously doesn't exist. Which way would you lean? More reach, better stealth, or distributed risk? Comment your answer, because this decision is being made right now, and the people making it don't all agree. If you want to understand the other side of this equation, what a Chinese Type 055 destroyer actually brings to a carrier threat scenario, and whether its sensor suite is as capable as its specifications suggest, that breakdown runs directly to the heart of why the targeting chain problem is harder than the DF-26's range makes it look. We've got that analysis coming. Subscribe so you don't miss it.